In this video, we're going to talk about the basics of supply. Supply is defined to be a relationship that exists between the price of a good and the quantity supplied in a given time period, ceteris paribus. Notice this definition sounds very similar to the definition of demand, except now we're looking at the decisions of suppliers instead of consumers. We can represent supply by using a supply schedule, which is nothing more than a listing of alternative prices and the quantity supplied at each of these prices. Equivalently, we could use a supply curve, which is just a graph of that relationship between price and quantity supplied. Or we could use a supply equation, which gives us a relationship between price and quantity supplied in a mathematical framework. And if you notice, all three of these representations capture exactly the same relationship. Just as we had a law of demand, we also have a law of supply. The law of supply states that there's a direct relationship between the price of a good and the quantity supplied, ceteris paribus, holding everything else equal, in a given time period. That's why that supply curve is upward sloping and why the supply function has a positive slope. The reason for this will be explained in much more detail a bit later in this course, but for now what we can note is that we've already seen that there's a law of increasing cost. That law of increasing cost states that as you devote more resources to any productive activity, the opportunity cost of each additional unit rises. What that means for our purposes here is that each time we try to produce more of a good beyond some point, the cost of additional units go up, and if it costs more to produce additional units, firms are only going to be willing to do that if the price is high enough to cover those additional costs. Now, just as we made a distinction between a change in quantity demanded and demand, we can make exactly the same distinction between a change in quantity supplied and a change in supply. When we change the price of a good, the quantity of the good supplied will change. That's illustrated in the diagram on the left. When the price rises from 2 to 3, the quantity supplied here rises from 35 to 55. A change in the price of the good affects the quantity supplied, but does not affect supply. A change in supply, though, occurs when the supply curve shifts. Look at the diagram on the right. We see that the curve has shifted in a rightward direction. What that means is that the quantity supplied has gone up at each and every price. In that case, we say that supply has increased. This is different than many other functional relationships you've seen before, where you measure an increase or decrease by the vertical direction the curve has changed. Because we're measuring the dependent variable on the horizontal axis here, what matters is whether the demand or the supply curve shifts to the right or to the left. A rightward shift in either demand or supply is a measure of an increase in demand or supply. A leftward shift is a decrease. So pay attention to the horizontal direction of the change to tell whether supply has increased or decreased. Just as we talked about a market demand curve as being the sum of the demand curves of individual consumers, we can think of the market supply curve in the same way. Again, we're going to simplify and assume that there's only two firms, firm X and firm Y, in a market. And the market supply is just going to be the sum of the quantity supplied by each and every firm. So in this case, we see that at a price of $2, firm X provides 35 units of the good. At a price of $2, firm Y will produce 20 units of the good. Therefore, the total quantity supplied in the market would be 35 plus 20, or 55, which is illustrated as a point on the market supply curve on the right. So just as we form the market demand curve by taking a horizontal summation of individual consumers' demand curves, the market supply curve is a horizontal summation of all the supply curves of individual firms. The determinants of supply are those factors that will cause the supply curve to shift. I'm going to start by listing them, and then we'll go through and talk about each one of these determinants in turn. The first is a change in the price of resources, those things that are used to produce output. Second is changes in technology and in the productivity of inputs. The third will be expectations of sellers. The fourth is the number of sellers. And the fifth is the prices of related goods and services. But note, we're talking about things that are related in production, not in consumption. That's a distinction that's important and is often confused when people first study this. A general principle that we'll see is that any factor that makes production more profitable will increase the amount supplied of a good. Anything that makes production less profitable will decrease the supply of a good. If the price of the resources, the land, the labor, the raw materials that you use to produce output goes up, production becomes less profitable, and in turn, firms will produce less. So supply will fall, and the supply curve will shift in a leftward direction, as illustrated in this diagram. Firms will only adopt new technologies if it makes production less costly. So introducing a new technology will result in lower costs, and with lower costs, there'll be an increase in firms' profitability, which will lead to more supply. Now, when we think about the expected future price, firms are facing a choice between selling something now or selling something in the future. Keep in mind that we're talking about the amount offered for sale, not the amount that's produced. That's a common source of confusion. If the expected future price of something goes up, firms faced with the choice between selling now and selling in the future will realize that they're better off producing it now, but holding it for later sale. And what that does, basically, it encourages producers to supply less of the good today and to hold products to sell at a higher future price. Because if you think that the thing you're selling is going to be worth more tomorrow, you'd have a strong incentive to wait until tomorrow to sell it. To avoid confusion here, remember that the supply curve is a relationship between price and the quantity of the good offered for sale, not the quantity of the good that's being produced. So what we see here is that when there's changes in expected prices, the effect on production and the effect on the quantity offered for sale are different. In terms of the shift in supply, it's only the impact on the quantity of the good offered for sale that matters. If there's an increase in the number of sellers, that simply raises supply because the supply curve is the sum of the quantity supplied by all firms. If we add more firms to that mix, the total amount offered for sale will increase. When we're talking about prices of other goods, we're talking about other goods that firms could produce. Don't confuse this with goods that are related in consumption. We're just talking about supply, and we're looking at the other things that firms could produce here. And in general, firms will be responding to the relative profitability of the different items that they sell. And if something becomes more profitable, they'll produce more of that, but they'll produce less of everything else. Imagine, for example, you're running a bakery and the price of pumpkin pies goes up because it's getting closer to holidays. Firms will choose to produce perhaps fewer cherry pies or fewer cakes. What happens basically is when something becomes more profitable, the supply of that good will go up, but the supply of everything else they produce will go down. If you're a farmer and you could grow either wheat or corn, if you think corn prices will go up, you'll devote more acreage to growing corn, but your supply of wheat will fall. So what matters here are the other goods you could produce and the mix of goods you choose to produce. That concludes our discussion of supply for now. In the next video, we'll combine demand and supply and discuss the concept of equilibrium and discuss how that equilibrium will change when demand or supply or both changes.